It is a beautiful evening, and I welcome you to a really special conversation. I have the honor tonight of speaking with Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie. We'll be discussing Rabbi Eliezrie's new book, Undaunted, how the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, saved Russian Jewry, reimagined American Judaism, and ignited a global Jewish experience. I'm really honored that I was one of the first to read it, and I read it cover to cover. Rabbi Eliezrie is the senior Chabad Shliach in Yorba Linda, California. He's the president of the Rabbinical Council of Orange County. He's the senior advisor to the JRNU, a voice of global Jewish affairs. He is an author, a lecturer, uh, a scholar, and it's an honor to have you here, Rabbi.
My pleasure to come out of Montreal and a podcast in Montreal where I spent probably some of the most important years of my life that changed my life totally.
Wow. I had a chance to read the book, and I'll tell you, it was absolutely gripping. It was inspiring. I've always wanted a book like this, and for those of you who are listening and watching, I'll tell you why soon. I've always wanted this. And I found myself in the middle of your book deeply moved by the story of Rabbi Schneerson. And it's not just a history, there's a lot of spirituality in it. And reading it, I felt like I was on a journey with the Rebbe from his heroic efforts in the Soviet Russia, war-torn Europe, and then his bold work in America and throughout the world. And what struck me most in your words was how human and relatable the Rebbe comes across. And so, for those of people who have never heard of Rabbi Schneerson, can you just introduce us to him?
So they've all heard of his son-in-law, the Rebbe. Everybody refers to as the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but somebody titled this book in a sense it's the Rebbe before the Rebbe, which is really a very interesting kind of definition about who the previous Rebbe was. The previous Rebbe lived, I think, in one of the most chaotic periods in Jewish history, which is really a remarkable moment, so to speak. You know, he's born in 1880 underneath the Tsarist rule. He lives through the Tsar. He lives through communism. He's struggling in Western Europe, and the last decade of his life he spends in the United States, which having a great influence here in the United States and in Canada. So he's a man who goes through unbelievable transition in life. And if you contrast his life with the life of the Rebbe, or at least the period that he was Rebbe, the previous Rebbe was Rebbe for 30 years, from 1920 to 1950. The Rebbe is Rebbe from 1951 into the early 90s. And he's in an environment of relative political stability, relative financial security. He really never leaves Brooklyn except to go to a summer camp once or twice. And here, the previous Rebbe's whole life is a tumultuous life of transition, of change, of imprisonment, of crisis, of oppression. And he's very different than his son-in-law, but really, in many ways, he also made his son-in-law into a son-in-law. It's really a great story about, which is also reflective of the drama of Jewish life in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where we went through such tremendous change. You know, the fall of the monarchies of Europe, World War I, World War II, the tragedy of the Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel. You know, we've had tumultuous events since then. You know, we're all in a sense almost in shock a little bit, but it hasn't worn off of it. Is that what's happened since October 7th? But as tragic as October 7th is, the events that, you know, in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were much more chaotic and much more tumultuous.
The word that keeps on coming up for me as I think of him is the word resilience. where do you think he got that resilience? He's a rabbi through the most difficult moments of Jewish life. How does that happen?
See, I didn't use the title of the book, Defiant or Resilient. I used the word Undaunted. He is defiant, but not in a way of fighting somebody who's good. He's resilient against anybody who wants to change Judaism. The first question, though, I think is an interesting question. Where did it come from? And I really feel that he saw himself as a emissary or as a son of his father. In other words, he constantly sees the mission that he is entrusted with is a mission given to him by his father. And I think his father imbued in him. I mean, there's a classic story. He's a young kid, 11 years old. He's in the town of Lubavitch, which today there's no Jews living in the town of Lubavitch, but for over a century it was an oasis of spirituality, a place of spiritual pilgrimage. Jews would come to get away from the oppression of the Tsar and become uplifted and inspired by the great Hasidic Rebbes that lived there. It was a place of sanctity and holiness. And he's an 11-year-old kid, and he encounters in the fair in the town of Lubavitch. Lubavitch was also a regional economic center, and they would have big public fairs there where people would come sell their wares. A man who's suddenly accosted by the police. So he stands up for this guy, and what's his name? And he stands up for this guy, and he faces down the police, and he gets arrested, and he gets thrown into jail. He's 11 years old. His father is out of town at the time. His father had his own health challenges, and what happens is that when his father finds out what happened to him, he says, okay. So you went to the jail because you defended another Jew. And what did you do in jail? You went and studied Mishnah. Because he says how when he was in the jail, he realized that he has to, what's his name? He's got to do something about, he decided not to waste his time, but to spend his time in a little bit of study. What does that teach an 11-year-old child about, you imagine, you got yourself arrested and you had a fight with a policeman. His father says, no, you did a great thing. You saved another Jew from some kind of oppression. That's what's being imbued in this young man when he's 11 years old. And I think that the values that his father implanted in him of self-sacrifice, of love for your fellow Jew, of a sense of personal responsibility for everybody, I think that's what carried him his whole life.
You can understand that it's an incredible story, but it seems relatable and also unrelatable at the same time. Like I don't know. Think about your own child at 11 years old, and obviously not living through Tsarist Russia and not living through those difficult times. You write this incredibly enchanting story. It was right in the beginning of the book, page 23, about how the Rebbe Rashab, about how he took his son into the synagogue and he opens the Holy Ark, the Aron Kodesh, and he declared that today I'm bringing my son to the Akedah.
Well, we have to tell this whole story in this context because
Absolutely.
I think it's a phenomenal story. So the previous Rebbe, his name is Yosef Yitzchak. In the summer months, his father, they lived in the town of Lubavitch, which had like 2,000 residents. But in the summertime, his father would relocate to a resort town, so to speak. I don't know what kind of resort you have in Tsarist Russia, but I don't know. I don't think it was the Catskills or Miami Beach or something like that. But the town was called Belivka. And during the summer, he would go there. And the extensive reason the father gave to the Hasidim was he wanted to have time because he had health concerns. But the previous Rebbe writes that the real reason that his father relocated there was to give him dedicated time during those years as he was a teenager between like 15 and 20, or from the time he's 15 to his early 20s. Once a week, the fifth Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Daber, his father, would travel to Lubavitch, and Hasidim that had come from far and wide, he'd do private meetings with them, and he'd see his mother, and he'd go back. Suddenly, on the eve of his 15th birthday, the night before, his father tells him, tomorrow we're going to Lubavitch. Get ready early. We're going to Lubavitch. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know what. He doesn't ask. They get in the wagon, they travel. And it's not like today you get in the car and you drive. In those days, you get in a wagon, it takes a few hours. They arrive in Lubavitch, they go to his grandmother's house. And they said, he tells his father, your mother's going to get nervous. Why are we coming a second time this week? Don't worry, he knows. She knows. And then they head out on the outskirts of the town of Lubavitch. And I've been there. Is buried two of the other Chabad Rebbes, the fourth Rebbe and the third Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel, his grandfather, and Menachem Mendel, the Tzemach Tzedek, his great-grandfather. And these are places, just like today, many people come and they pray at the oil at the grave of the Rebbe in New York. This is where the oil was in Lubavitch, on the edge of the town of Lubavitch. And to get there, you have to walk through a pathway through a marsh. And then you come to this cemetery that rises slowly over a light hill. And in the middle is the building with the oil. And next to it is a synagogue. Now, that synagogue has been rebuilt. It's a beautiful synagogue with wood floors, with an ark, with large windows on both sides of the ark, that the light beams in the room. And from the synagogue, you walk directly into the oil, which is an enclosure, like a stone enclosure around two graves, with no roof. And it's very similar to the oil in New York, in Montreal Cemetery, which today people come to pray at the grave of the Rebbe and the previous Rebbe. And he still doesn't know what's going on. It's early morning. They finally get there after a 4-hour ride. It's morning. And his father takes him into the synagogue. That is his 15th birthday. And he doesn't explain to him yet what's happening. And his father, and they're alone. You have to understand, there's nobody there. There's no minyan, there's no chassidim, there's no tumult. It's just the father and the son. And he opens up the Aron Kodesh, the holy ark, in the front of the synagogue. And he, with his son standing next to him, his father, Rabbi Yisroel Bernath, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, says, Abraham brought his son to the Akedah. Abraham brought his son, what we call the Akedah, is the binding of Isaac. We all know the story. We read it on the high holidays. It's the final test of Abraham. Will he sacrifice his son and give him up to God, which is an ultimate test, because Abraham is told that his whole mission is to bring godliness into the world. He's told he's going to have a beautiful nation. He has one son. He's going to sacrifice his only son. It's going to sacrifice his whole mission. But nevertheless, Abraham brings his son. So the father, Rabbi Yisroel Bernath, he says, I am bringing my son to the Akedah, to the sacrifice. The son doesn't know exactly what's going on. And at this dramatic moment, the father begins to cry, and the son begins to cry. And he doesn't fully understand it. And then he explains it. He says, I am today inaugurating you into Avodas HaKlal, which is a Hebrew term for community work. You are going to take upon yourself the responsibility of being a Jewish leader. And for the next 4 or 5 hours, the father sits with the son and gives him the history of 150 years from the time of Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, known as the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, who passed away in 1812, of all the different activities of the different Chabad Rebbes. And his father is the fifth Rebbe, and he will eventually become the sixth Rebbe. What they did over a period of 150, 180 years to take care of the welfare of the Jews of Russia and even beyond Russia, where they had some kind of influence. This is this dramatic moment. He is telling this young man, a 15-year-old teenager, you are today becoming a Jewish community leader. And it's really intriguing. One of the Chabad historians told me in a line like this. He said the previous Rebbe never had a life for himself. From the time he's 15, he's propelled into community service. And a few months later, there's a big rabbinic conference somewhere, I don't know exactly where it was. And he is sent to that rabbinical conference together with his teacher, a man called the Rashbatz, which is a very prominent scholar, a man in his 70s. The rabbi accompanying the young Rabbi Eliezrie is told, listen, don't talk too much. Let my son begin to take a role of leadership. You are taking a 15-year-old kid and you're a teenager. You're not going to go sit in yeshiva with your buddies. You're not going to learn like the regular. You are, and who's your father? Your father's one of the most prominent leaders of Russian Jewry at this time. And you're going to stand by his side and get involved. And because of that, he gets to know all the great rabbinical leaders like Rav Chaim Brisker and Rav Chaim Oizer and the Holy Chafetz Chaim and all these other prominent people. And he gets propelled right away into a place of communal leadership, which basically set the tone for his whole life. I think it's really a dramatic moment of this personal sacrifice, because personally, what is he giving up? For his own life, there's nothing now. His whole life is dedication to others.
And that being in service really kind of paints the picture of who he is, what he becomes, what later the Rebbe becomes, and essentially the kind of self-sacrifice of what has become Chabad of even today.
Yeah, but there's a very big difference with the self-sacrifice of today and the self-sacrifice that the previous Rebbe had to go through. And I happen to think it's the reverse, that it's the self-sacrifice of the previous Rebbe in Russia, which created the culture for the self-sacrifice we're finding today. But what is the difference in self-sacrifice? Let's be very, very honest. Some Chabad rabbi goes off. I mean, there is places of great self-sacrifice. 2 weeks ago, I was in Jerusalem, and I was at an event honoring people who are involved with running the Jewish communal structure in Ukraine and Russia. Interesting, they may be at war, but they brought to Israel for 3 days all the people who run the youth programs and the schools. We have a network between the two countries. We probably have 70, 80 schools and synagogues and teen programs and so they brought everybody except for the rabbis and the Rebbitzins for a conference in Jerusalem. There were about 150, 200 people there. And the last day, in the evening, they had an evening of tribute. And I was invited to come because I was in Israel. And as it was mentioned earlier by Rabbi Bernath, I'm a member of I'm the advisor to JRNU, which is Jewish Relief Network Ukraine, which is our organizational mechanism to bring relief work to the Jews in Ukraine. And we spent probably close to $30 million already in relief work in Ukraine since the beginning of this war. But I was speaking to the rabbi in Rebbitzin from the town of Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is 50 miles south of Dnieper, which is one of those, I think it's the second largest city in Ukraine. It's a city with about 3,000 Jews. It's 20 miles from the border of Russia. And I know the rabbi pretty well. And he tells me he got shelled a little bit, but his wife was sitting next to him. And I asked him, what's it like? And she says, it's terrible. She's being shelled on a daily basis. But that's unusual. What is the main challenge of a Chabad rabbi today or Chabad Rebbitzin? They come into some suburban neighborhood in Montreal and they want to raise the money to buy a building or run a program and a project. There are no police cars sitting outside the door that's going to arrest them and send them off to Siberia. There's nobody who's putting their lives at risk. There's no Tsarist anti-Semitism that's going to orchestrate a pogrom down the block, even though we do have problems in some Western countries right now that we have to worry about a little bit, but still the government is on our side. So there is a quality of self-sacrifice in Chabad today, which means we'll put everything online for the principle, for the ideal that we're trying to do, which is to teach Torah, to spread Judaism, to strengthen Jewish life, to support Israel, whatever, etc. But at the same time, the level of self-sacrifice that we have to have as American rabbis, America and in the United States and around the world, is, except in this unusual case in Ukraine, is incomparable to what these people went through in Russia. And I'll finish with this. When I was a young kid in yeshiva, one of the things that deeply impressed me was that the previous Rebbe created this clandestine network to keep Judaism alive in the former Soviet Union. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later today also. Now, a lot of those Hasidim were sent to Siberia because they organized Jewish schools. They ran programs like Rabbi Bernath runs. They made a yeshiva. They built a mikveh, whatever it may be. And for that, they were sent to Siberia. And there was a joke by Hasidim, 2 years in Siberia is a mitzvah. 10 years is a hiddur mitzvah. It's like a beautiful mitzvah. In other words, if you went to Siberia for a year or two, big deal. It's like paying the toll. Everybody goes to Siberia for a while. But we had teachers in yeshiva that spent 7, 8, 9, 10 years in the Russian prison system in Siberia in the 30s and the 40s. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. They were old men by then. And I looked at these people every single day and I said to myself, wow, look at the self-sacrifice that these people have. So when I'm worried about the challenges in my life, and there is a motif of self-sacrifice in Chabad today, and I think it was what happened in Russia brought it to the culture today that we're willing to sacrifice to do what has to be done. So it may mean that, you know what, if you're having financial challenges, you'll mortgage your house so you can pay payroll at the local Jewish school. But nobody's sending you to Siberia. Life is a little different.
The way that I see you and the many conversations that we've had is to me a connection with the past in a particular way. I'll explain it. And you write this so well in your book, is that the previous Rebbe was really a connection to the shtetl, to the yesteryear of Hasidic life, to his grandmother Rebbetzin Rivka, and the stories that he tells. I mean, both in his diary and then in his Likkutei Deburim, are really kind of a lot of what we know in the Hasidic world, at least in our world, of painting that picture of yesteryear was the connection that the previous Rebbe had with that other world that didn't exist already in his time. And what's fascinating to me about you is you're my almost my connection. You're alive today as my connection with his world because you grew up. I came to Montreal at the tail end of his students that he had sent. He had sent 9 students to Montreal, I think at the time that I came, 6 of them were still around, and I knew them and had many conversations with them over the years that I had been here. But you grew up in really the golden age of those students of his, and you lived in Montreal, studied here, and it's amazing to me is that you wrote this book, and that to me, I see you as kind of this connection with his world.
That's very interesting. So let me tell you a story about connection to that world, it underscores the point that I made earlier, which was one of those, there's moments in life that you get deeply touched. But I want to share with you a story of that connection to that world. It's not about Montreal because I think we need to talk about Montreal, but it's about something that happened to me around 1971, 1972. We were students in yeshiva, and when it came to the holidays like Purim, so the Rebbe insisted that his students would go visit soldiers on the front lines. And so it was one Purim. And those nowadays, if you want to get in the car in the area of Tel Aviv, where we went to yeshiva in a town called Kfar Chabad, which is not far from Tel Aviv, you get on a freeway and you can drive quickly. In a few hours, you're already in the Golan Heights. But in those days, there was just 2-lane highways. And we were in yeshiva and we were told that we would leave at midnight, drive 5-6 hours through the night, and we're going to arrive in the morning, early morning in the Golan Heights, and we're going to start visiting army bases. Now, at this period of time, between the Yom Kippur and the 6-Day War, was Milchamat HaTasha, which means the war between the wars of attrition. The Syrians, and to a degree the Egyptians, but I went to the north, not to the south. The Syrians would shell the Israelis on a regular basis. So, and we, the kids in yeshiva, young kids, 18, 19 years old, there's an expression in Hebrew, chipasnu action. We wanted a little action. We'll get out of school for a day or two. We're going to travel to the north. We have a little bit of excitement. We didn't expect we're going to get shelled. We just figured we'll visit the soldiers. We'll give out Purim packages. We'll bring a little holiday cheer. It'll be a great time. Anyway, we get in the bus. We ride to the top. We get to the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights today is not that developed, but it was much less developed. And we start going along the front lines with the Syrian border from base to base. And there was a series of what's called Moazim, which is Hebrew word for bunkers. And we got to one base. By that time, it was about 10 o'clock in the morning. We've been already, this is like our third base. And it started like 6:30, we started. And listen, you're a soldier, and a bunch of guys turn up, and they got Humintash, and they bring a little bit of vodka and a little bit of whiskey, a little bit of scotch. I don't know if we brought Canadian Club, but we brought some scotch with. And you're saying l'chaim with the soldiers and whatever. So I was putting on tefillin with an officer. And as we're putting on tefillin with the officer, the Syrians begin to shell us. At that point, he rips off the tefillin. He tells us to get in the truck. There's a strange word in Hebrew. In those days, a military truck was called the command car. I have no idea why, like a pickup truck with a little bit bigger was called the command car. We get in the truck, and we're running out of the base, which is being shelled by the Syrians. And there's one old chassid, one of these Russian chassidim who had been to Siberia, and he looks at us. We're a bunch of 18-year-old kids, some of Israelis, some Americans. Now we have a story to tell our parents, our friends. We were shelled by the Syrians. We are we had a little excitement in our lives. And the truck, and we're rushing out from the front lines. And he looks to us and tells us in Yiddish, and I'm going to translate into English, he tells us, today you had a phenomenal honor. You had such a remarkable opportunity. And we looked at him, we said, what kind of opportunity do we have? What kind of honor do we have? What kind of special moment did we have in our lives? We could have been killed. What are you talking about? And then he said these words which become seared into my soul. Today you put your life on the line for another Jew. Here's a man who went to Siberia because he was running an underground school in some town in Russia. And the Rebbe says, go to visit the soldiers. And well, most of the people his age were comfortable to stay in Kfar Chabad and be with their families. He got on the bus at midnight and he traveled for 6 hours with a bunch of young kids. And he said, I'm going to do the mission. And he said, today you put your life on the line for your fellow. This is the self-sacrifice that the previous Rebbe did it, but it wasn't like today. What are you worried about? You went to a synagogue in New York because you wanted to make immigration and a bunch of people are protesting outside. They're not going to kill you. We're talking about Russia. We're talking about the KGB, the KGB. You're talking about Siberia. You're talking about death sentences. It's a whole different kind of world. So those people, I knew those people. They ingrained in us that sense of what's his name. But honestly, the Montrealers, they were Polishers. They didn't go to Siberia. They all came from Poland. And there's an old joke in Chabad. There's the Polisher and the Russians, or the Polish and the Russians. They have a little competition between themselves, like two different baseball teams. The 9 that came to Montreal, which is a story of absolute transformation from Montreal, all were Polish yeshiva boys who had run away to Lithuania. And from Lithuania, they came to, in what's his name? And they came in September of 1941, they came to Montreal. It was actually, they had self-sacrifice, but but they were real role models of piety, of spirituality, of scholarship. They were phenomenal people, but they didn't have that Russian experience, the Montrealers.
A lot of Montrealers don't know how much they built up the Montreal Jewish community.
Yeah, it's so interesting to say. I have here, I just pulled this out. This is a book called Canadian Jews. It was published in 1939. It talks about Jewish life in Canada. I'll just give you an example of what was happening in Montreal. There was not one Orthodox day school in Montreal in 1940. It didn't exist. There was a bunch of Orthodox shuls, and the only 2 schools that existed, I don't know if they exist today. I remember on the corner of Westbury and Van Horn, there was a school called the Parrott School. Does that still exist?
It still exists, but it's not there anymore.
Okay. So they had established in Montreal 2 Yiddishist schools. Now, you have to understand what the Yiddishists were. The Yiddishist movement started at the turn of the 20th century. And they said, you know what? Let's get rid of Jewish religion. We're going to build Jewish identity on the speaking Yiddish, on having Yiddish culture, on Shalom Aleichem, on stories, and all of this. And they even created a network of schools many of them were called the Parrott schools, where they taught in Yiddish to children. And they figured if they have an attachment to the language, that's going to keep their Jewish identity. There were no Orthodox day schools, no yeshivas, nothing in Montreal. They didn't exist. It was there was a bunch of Hebrew schools where kids would go after they went to public school during the day. And as I heard Rabbi Handel, who became one of the most prominent rabbis in Montreal, tell me, actually it's quoted in the book, he said even the rabbis in town, their children were running stores that were open on Shabbos. He said in Warsaw, where he came from, he says a Jew would dare opening a store on Shabbos. In Montreal, the rabbi was going to shul and his son was going to run the shop. It was a different kind of culture. So traditional Judaism was on the downhill in Montreal. And what happens is in October of 1941, and don't forget, America doesn't enter the war until December of 41. And so Japan is still not in the war. there was 80 visas issued for yeshiva students that were in Shanghai, because there was groups of yeshiva students that had come from Poland. They got to Shanghai. Only 25 of them or 26 of them came on the boat for various reasons. And of them, 9 of them were Chabad students. And 2 yeshivas were established. One was the Chabad yeshiva, and the other was Merkaz HaTorah. And each one of these yeshivas has made a phenomenal contribution to the transformation of Montreal. And today, I think it's fair to say that Montreal is the most religious city in North America for Jews. I don't think there's a city in North America that has a higher percentage of Orthodox observant Jews and that has a richness of Judaism, which is so strong. Montreal is a very unusual city. I haven't done a statistical analysis, but I think that's true. I mean, in a place like Los Angeles, you might have 10% Orthodox Jews. In Montreal, the number is much higher.
I think it's Jews that are engaged in Orthodox life or in religious Jewish life
Whatever
is
it is,
very
I
high.
didn't do the study, but when you think about it, that the secular Yiddishists were controlling the major force, were controlling and everything in 1939, 1940, you guys went through a revolution. And that revolution, this is so interesting about the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe at this time is in New York. He had escaped Europe in a whole miraculous story, which you could make a Netflix series about how the American government and the German government colluded to save his life. But he's in America. He has a yeshiva with 20, 30 students. That's it. The whole kit and caboodle. Now 9 outstanding students come from the students come from Lithuania. They had studied in Warsaw, went to Lithuania, they had got to Shanghai, and from Shanghai they come to Montreal. You could think to yourself, you know what? Let them come to New York. We'll get them visas, and they'll come to New York, and then it'll take the yeshiva in New York. It'll make it really into a stellar institution. He says, no way. He says, I want them to stay in Montreal. Why? I want to change Judaism in Montreal. He sees their arrival as divine providence in the moment that Montreal can be transformed to a place of Torah, a place of Jewish scholarship, a place of Jewish spirituality. And today, Montreal, there's hardly, I think, a piece of Jewish life in Montreal that was not impacted by that decision. He sees their mission into change Montreal. So the city, which has a few Hebrew schools, maybe 30% of the kids are going to Hebrew school. The only 2-day schools are secular Yiddish schools, which are not talking about God and spirituality. They're talking about Shalom Aleichem and singing "If I Was a Rich Man" in Yiddish. Suddenly becomes one of the most beautiful Jewish communities in the world.
It is a beautiful Jewish community. I always say that he would have gotten, I mean, he should get a Pulitzer Prize, definitely in Hebrew and Hasidic teachings. The way everything this was unique about him, everything he actually wrote himself, which was unique for a Rebbe. And the way he writes, I mean, especially his diary, when you walk into a room, you walk into a room with him. I mean, and he's very raw and real about his life and his challenges. He talks about, and you write in the book, his early challenges of not being able to write.
I think we have to separate the two things. There are his writings, which includes his stories and his diaries and his letters, and his Hasidic discourses, his Jewish scholarship. I think it's two separate arenas. But let's first talk about the arena of his writings. Now, if you look at his writings, and if today he published these writings in Hebrew, he definitely could win a Pulitzer Prize. It's poetic, it's beautiful, it's descriptive, it's remarkable. Isaac Bashevis Singer would be in envy of the writing of the previous Rebbe. Now, part of this writing is very calculated because when does we begin to see his writing when he leaves Russia. And to set the stage for this is that he is arrested by the Soviet government because he's involved with keeping a Jewish underground, not a Jewish underground that blows up buildings, a Jewish underground that educates children in 1927. He's sentenced to death. And then that death sentence is canceled and he's exiled to Riga. And in Riga, he lives in Riga, and then eventually he moves to Warsaw. He's encountering a population which is on the process of assimilation. He also is seeing a lot of people who have a background, their great-grandfather or grandfather or the mother-in-law, or whatever it is, was Hasidic and had was more religious and more observant. So he wants to imbue the people in Central Europe, in Western Europe, who are on the process of assimilation. And we have to understand this. At the onset of World War I, 75% of the Jews in Poland were Orthodox observant, Shabbos observant, Shomer Shabbos, we call it. By 1940, by the beginning of 1939, the beginning of World War II, it went from 75 to 50%. That's a big drop. So we see already a process of assimilation going on for a whole host of reasons we're not going to go into today. What does the Rebbe want to do? He wants to inspire people with an identity. So he begins publishing his writings that have been going on for decades. Before that, we don't see his writings. They're never published. Maybe they were talked about. I wasn't around in the 1920s. I don't know what he talked about, but they're not published until he arrives in Western Europe, where he wants to instill in people a Jewish identity. So you, Rabbi Bernath, will be sitting here decades later reading it, and you'll have a sense of a world which has gone by, but he's captured that world in his writing. And the other thing is his letters. He's a very emotionally honest. He's there's people that they don't share with you their inner worlds, and not with every person the previous Rebbe wrote did he share his inner world. But we have about 6,500 published letters of the Rebbe. I've gotten a bunch of other letters that were never published, including some that were captured by the Russian army in World War II. And I had to, without saying exactly how I did it, I was able, in Russia, with a few rubles, a lot of things can be accomplished. I was able to get some of those letters that he wrote to his wife while he was visiting in America in the late 1929, 1930. But you see in the letters, in particular, some of the people he writes to, a tremendous sense of emotional honesty. And he's really revealing his inner world, his anguishes, his difficulties, his hardships, the pain. Like he writes a letter in 1942, 1943. He's like, here in America, what do I have? It's a cold and sensitive place. People are not interested in my agenda of spreading Torah. I think about what I had in Poland. I think about what I had in Europe. I'm in an icy place. It's like and I don't have people that are really listening to me because he has very few Hasidim in America. He has very few Hasidim. And he's like full of anguish. And he's expressing this in a letter that he's sending to somebody. So there is a rawness in his correspondence, which is very, very remarkable. And when you contrast that with the Rebbe himself, the Rebbe was an extremely private person. And we have very little world, the Lubavitcher Rebbe who passed away, the seventh Rebbe, we don't have much of a sense of his inner world. Occasionally, he would let out his own internal emotions, but those are very, very rare. The previous Rebbe wears it on his chest. We see it clearly. And I think what is unusual about this book, and again, I'm not the objective observer because I'm the guy who wrote it, is you have a whole literary culture today that has popped up in the last 25, 30 years of books which talk about great spiritual leaders in Judaism. Now, a lot of them are published by Orthodox groups, and they want everything to look wonderful. The rabbi was born, and at 6 years old, he knew the whole Mishnah, and 10, he knew the whole Gemara. He never had an emotional difficulty in his life. He lived happily ever after, and everything he did was holy and wonderful. Here, the previous Rebbe tells you about all his hardships, about his struggles, about his anguish, like there's a beautiful letter. He writes his wife in 1930. He's in St. Louis. And he's visiting in the United States. So we have to understand something about his visit to the United States to give it a sense, is that he comes here for 1 year in late 1929 through 1930, and he has three purposes in the trip. Number one is to reconnect with people from the Hasidic background. Number two is to strengthen Judaism in America. And most importantly, he's really concerned about the fate of Russian Jewry, and he wants to work with the major Jewish organizations in America to get them to support the work that he's doing in Russia in a surreptitious way, and to raise money for Russian Jewry. And to give you a sense of his visit, he meets with the President of the United States. And just to give you this, according to Chicago Sun-Times, this is not a Jewish publication, when he got off the train station in Chicago in I guess around February, March of 1930, there were 15,000 people waiting for him. Wow. When he got off the train station in Detroit, there's 10,000. These are non-Jewish press reports. It will give you a sense. So he goes to St. Louis, and there they say more people welcomed the Rebbe than when Weizmann came, who eventually becomes the first president of Israel, or when Chief Rabbi Cook came. He got like the biggest welcome in the universe. There were like 3,000 to 4,000 people waiting for him at the train station. But he comes home one night and they had some big event, and of course they're honoring the Rebbe. So he writes to his wife, I have this kind of mundane feeling. They give me these honors. I don't want the honors. It's not what I want. It's not what I feel. And we know that every time he came to a city, the day he would come to a city, he would fast, because he says when they give you honor, you have to minimize yourself. So here he's writing to his wife about his inner feelings about how these people are giving them, you're a great man and you're a great rabbi and you're great this and you're great that. He says, I can't stand this stuff. I don't want this. This is a private conversation between him and his wife. And you see this kind of insight into his world, which is really very special. And it gives us, and here we have a man who's living on a higher spiritual plane. He's connected to God in a very profound way. His whole life is spirituality, godliness, Torah. That's all he wants. And he's constantly being pushed into a role of communal leadership, which is not something he wants to do, but it's something he has to do. And you see this inner conflict within him. I'll finish with this. He has a diary. He writes in this visit to America. It's a very, I got hold of one of the diaries, which is unpublished. And he writes, all I want to do is to sit in what's called Ohel Shel Torah, in a place of Torah and spirit and spirituality, and where people are serving God. He doesn't want to do all these things. He's not having a good time. All he wants is to sit and learn Torah, and he'd rather be in a small little town with a bunch of Jews who are sitting and praying and learning the whole time and being connecting to God above, rather than going to see the president in the White House.
Wow. So now I want to get into scholarship a bit, if we can.
Okay.
For me, a lot of my this book, this published work of his had profound impact on my life. Sefer Maamarim can trace him, and a lot of my teachings that I've quoted him, that I get from this book. I find that he colors in Hasidic philosophy in a way that I don't think anyone else does. For example, uh, the Tanya talks about these two souls, the animal soul and the divine soul, and that they are both taking over the small city. And the previous Rebbe asks a very simple question, which is a question I remember asking as a student, which is, if there's two souls inside the body and the body is nothing but the soul, what are they trying to take over? And he talks about this rational soul, the nefesh hasichlis, the rational soul. And this is, at least for me, the first time I've ever seen that kind of colored explanation from a more psychological perspective. There's a couple of ideas that you talk about and that I think are really prominent in his work. And I think that today, especially with what's going on in the world, the idea of bitachon, of trust in God, that from the perspective of the previous Rebbe, he teaches it not as a lofty concept. Can you talk about like
I
that?
don't think he teaches it. I think he lives it.
Exactly.
It's not. It's first thing. First, let's put in context when he started these memoirs that you're reading right now, which you're discussing. Now, what is a mimer for people who are listening? It's a Hasidic discourse which explores broad theological and spiritual themes based on Hasidic philosophy. And a mimer, which means a saying, but really it's you could call it almost like a treatise or like a philosophical discussion. He changes his style when he arrives in Western Europe. In the period of time, from he becomes Rebbe in 1920 until he gets to Western Europe in 1927, the Memorim are not, they're more obtuse, they're more intellectual, they're just focused on the Hasidic community. When he gets to Riga in 1927, again, he's exiled. He doesn't want to go. He's been thrown out of Russia because it's otherwise his death. He begins to take lofty concepts of Hasidism and brings down in more simpler intellectual terms, because what he's trying to do is to take the concepts and ideas of Hasidic teachings and reach a much broader market. In fact, the seventh Rebbe, his successor, the Rebbe, explains that this is what he's doing at this point in his life, because there's a idea that Hasidic philosophy is going through stages. With the Alter Rebbe, so much is revealed as it goes on generation to generation. So he's pushing the edge, the limit, so to speak, to bring these lofty philosophical concepts on a level that the average Jew in Lithuania, in Poland, in Latvia, or Montreal can understand and grasp, and he makes that relevant and important in their lives. So there is a real shift in style at that point, because, and also he does something else. He does two other very important things. Number one, he begins to translate Hasidic discourses, Mamorim, into foreign languages, German, etc. And number two, he begins to advocate strongly that Mamorim, Hasidic discourses, should not just be studied by men, but they should be studied by women. And he supports strongly the establishment of women's organizations where women are going to study Hasidic discourses. Now, you understand this. There had been a move in Poland to create centers of Jewish education for women, championed by a woman called Sarah Schneer. And she created what's called the Beis Yaakov movement. And I'm sure that Montreal has a Beis Yaakov today. I'm sure it's an outstanding school. But they didn't deal with theological and philosophical issues. They taught Chumash, Torah, Jewish law, traditions, but they weren't engaging with lofty spiritual theological ideas. The Rebbe says, no, we're going to begin that whole process. And this is all about revealing the inner ideas of Hasidus to a broader public. So what you are reading in that set of Mamorim Contrasim, is really Mamorim that all of us can relate to, and they can give us powerful lessons in our own lives. Now, one more thing I want to add. I did not in this book attempt to analyze the Mamorim. That needs a whole other intellectual conversation. And I write it in the introduction to the book. We're not attempting to do that. The book is focusing on his life and talks about the role of Mamorim and some of the central ideas of Hasidus. But to properly analyze that intellectual gift that he's left to us. Today we have 200 volumes of his Mamorim, his letters, his talks. That is another monumental effort that needs to be undertaken to bring to seriously analyze in a proper way the 30 years of Mamorim that he gave to all of us.
Right. I see that, and to me, that's that's always been my relationship with him. So reading your book, it almost opened up a different relationship, which is more experiential. And like you said, a lot of the ideas that he paints are not just ideas where education comes from this Greek word edukara to convey a message, but he actually lives his teachings.
No, he
And you
lives
can
his
see,
teaching. There's no question he lives his teaching. That's all he wants. Now, interesting. What did he do on his day of his wedding? We know this happened either the day of the wedding, the day before the wedding. We're not sure exactly. The Chabad Yeshiva in Montreal is called Yeshivas Tomchei Tmimim, or they gave it a fancy name, Rabbinical College of Canada, which I thought was probably, they thought of the name to make it sound good to the public, but the official Hebrew name is Yeshivas Tomchei Tmimim. What is Yeshivas Tomchei Tmimim? The previous Rebbe gets married in 1897. His father, who was Rebbe at the time, and he's 17, just 17 years old. He's getting married young, which was the style of the Rebbes. And this either happened on the day of the wedding or a day or two before the wedding. We're not sure because it's a little blurred, but the story is very important. He comes to his father, who is the Lubavitcher Rebbe at the time, who is himself also very young. He's 37 years old. And he says to him, I want you to establish a yeshiva, a Chabad yeshiva. Now, there was many great yeshivas in Europe at the time. There was in Brisk, and there was in Kletsk, and there was in Mir, and there was in Slobodka, and there was many great yeshivas. But he wants to establish, his father to establish yeshiva. And his father had been thinking about this for some years. And his father's first reaction is, he tells him in Yiddish, misnagdish shtick. That's something good for the Lithuanian yeshiva students. I'm not interested. But the father and son have a deep conversation. And the son is trying to convince the father, the previous Rebbe is trying to convince his father, the fifth Rebbe, open the yeshiva. He finally says, you know what? I will think about it. I'm going to daven at the oil. He's going to go to the graves of his ancestors and meditate if he should make the yeshiva or not. He comes back And again, we're not sure if it's the day of the wedding, the day before the wedding. And he says to his son, okay, you're getting a wedding gift. I'm giving you the yeshiva. We're going to open the yeshiva, but know what you're getting into. It's not so simple. Now, what happens with this yeshiva? What's different? Yeshivas till then and till today focus on Talmudic scholarship. In some yeshivas, there's a study of Musar, of ethics, but not of the concepts of Hasidic philosophy, which are grappling with number one, what is the purpose of life? Why are we here? What is good and evil? What do we need to accomplish spiritually? And also asking the big question: what is divine providence? What is God? How do we define God? How can we define God? What is time? What is place? All of the lofty theological. Why are we here? What are we here for? So the idea was you go to yeshiva, and who went to yeshiva in Europe? Very few. I mean, it was a few thousand students. It was the best of the best. It was the best of the best. They went to these yeshivas. And now he's coming along and says, no, we're going to make a whole new kind of yeshiva where a third of the time is going to be dedicated to lofty theological conversation and study, which is going to change the way these people are. Now, his father wants to make the yeshiva. There's a lot of opposition in the Chabad community to this yeshiva. They feel it's not going to be successful. But the father understands that the yeshiva is going to change the way Jews think, because instead of just being about Talmudic scholarship, which is very, very important, we want to get into the neshama, to the soul, to the spirituality. We want to accentuate the idea of avodah, about serving God. We want to focus on the internal spiritual makeup of people and the internal spiritual makeup of the world. We want to ask theological problems. How is God bilti balgul? How does he transcend time and place? And how is God within time and place? Is God a he or a she? Why do we use human terminology? All of these kinds of important kinds of concepts, and really focus on developing students who have a deep spiritual connection to godliness and spirituality. He wants to change the spiritual metabolism of the Jewish people. And that's what Yeshivas Tomchei Mimim did. The Tomchei Mimim means the supporters of the pure. The name was given later on, taken from a verse, a line that we say every year in Simchas Torah when we dance for the Torah. But so the previous Rebbe is the instigator, together with his father. They are the founders of one of the most remarkable educational enterprises in the world, which has created generations of rabbis and Jewish community leaders, which has changed the face of Judaism. I mean, let's be very honest. There's 6,600 Chabad shluchim in the world today. They're all graduates of Tomchei Mimim. What gives them the spiritual metabolism? How does the guy in China keep his religious identity even though he's not living in a religious community? It's what he learned in this yeshiva. The whole system of education was revolutionized. And this is one of the accomplishments of the previous Rebbe together with his father. Wow. And it was the gift of his wedding. It was his wedding gift.
Wow.
And
yeah, I'm a product of it.
It was the trust. The most important purpose is his son, when he was considering moving to America, when the Rebbe was considering moving to America, his main question was, can I make a yeshiva there? The yeshiva is a sacred trust given to him by his father.
I'm a product of it, and I guess by proxy, everyone else here as well, as we study together.
Right. I am for sure. What's molded me into who I am today.
Yeah, absolutely. What was something that was shocking that you discovered in your research that you think is applicable to just us having a conversation?
The thing that shocked me, well, there's two or three things. Number one, I think I learned about the Rebbe's ability to adapt to totally different situations. In other words, the challenges of Tsarist Russia, where he's not yet Rebbe, he's with his father. But when he becomes Rebbe, what he faces in communism, what he faces in Western Europe, and he faces in America are three different paradigms, and he adapts successfully to each one of them. There's a lot of great European rabbis that came to America, but they were still in Europe. He figures out America, and he figures out Poland, and he figures out Russia. So that's one of the things that surprised me. A more individualistic thing was something else. He always has a sense that his life was directed by divine providence. And there's one caveat in the book which really surprised me. There's a few, but I'll share with you one. We'll see how much time we have for more. That in the Saturday night, the World War II begins on September 1st, 1939. It's a Friday morning. The Saturday night before, there was a rabbi in America called Rabbi Yisroel Jacobson. He was really the mover and shaker that got Chabad established in America. And the Rebbe at this time is living on the outskirts of Warsaw in a town called Dotwotsk, which is a suburb where there's a lot of rabbis and Jewish learning and yeshivas. And his yeshiva had been moved to Dotwotsk. And he was also there because it was good for him. The air was good. It was a good place for him. And Rabbi Jacobson had brought 6 American boys to study in the yeshiva in Warsaw. This is where, by the way, the 9 boys that came to Montreal, the revolutionized Jewish life in Montreal, Rabbi Rudel, Rabbi Galitsky, Rabbi Hendel, Rabbi Kramer, Rabbi Tenenbaum, who eventually left, all of the 9 guys that came, Rabbi Kadlarsky, they were all students of the yeshiva in Dotwotsk. And so the Saturday night before the war, Jacobson's about to go back to America. He brought these 6 American boys. He's leaving them there. And he goes into a private meeting with the Rebbe, with the previous Rebbe. And the Rebbe says to him like this: I've been thinking about making the move to America for a long time. I wrote a letter that was a very distinguished follower of Chabad called Rabbi Shmuel Levitin, who was in the United States. He says, I wrote a letter to Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Levitin, and I asked him, do you think I can make a good yeshiva in America? Will it work? And he said, yes. And I see the American boys that you brought here. And I see there had been a group of Americans that came before also. 3 Americans had come earlier, now 6 more came. And they were very worried that the pampered Americans are going to have a rough time in Poland. You know, this was not, it's not the Ritz. It's not going to the Hilton. It's like a 2-star Motel 6, you know what I mean? And he was worried that they wouldn't do well. And I've seen how well they've done. And I feel that they can, I see that so he assured me, the rabbi in America wrote me a letter that I can make yeshiva in America. I've decided to make the move. I'm going to move in about 6 months. But then he tells him the caveat. He says, my whole life I've been spending dedicated to others. And I want to make a yeshiva in America. That's my goal. But at the same time, I want to change my focus. I don't want to be involved with all kinds of broader community issues like I was when I visited 10 years earlier. I want to focus on the Chabad community. And he tells him this line, Ich will sein a Rebbe for Hasidim and nicht a Rebbe for the ganze Welt. I want to be a Rebbe for Hasidim and not a Rebbe for the whole world. I'm going to focus inward on my community. Now, you have to understand, he's not well. He has MS. He's had a lot of medical problems. He's in a wheelchair. He's got, he's not, his condition is not great. And he says, I'm going to be 60 years old. I'm going into my sabbatical year, the 7th, so to speak, decade of my life. And I want to refocus. The Rebbe's not going to go play golf and retire. He wants to say Mamorim. He wants to teach Hasidic teachings to his people. He wants to deal with his community. He doesn't want to solve the problems of the whole world. That's September. That is the beginning of September 1939. In March of 1940, he gets off the boat. And he declares, America is not different. I'm changing Judaism in the United States. And what does he do the last 10 years of his life? He makes a revolution in American Judaism. What happened? He saw the destruction of Europe, and he said, and he told this to a group of Hasidim before he left Riga, he said, I am forced to go by divine providence. He sees his life, he sees a new challenge in life, and he meets that challenge. So this ability, he sees the divine providence is telling him, you can't just come to America now and just focus on your 50, 100, 500, whatever it's going to be, Chabad followers and make a yeshiva with 50 students. No, you got to change Judaism in the whole country. And that is a very interesting realization of what your purpose in life is. And I think the lesson to all of us is, I think there's 2 powerful lessons here. Number one, we go through life and sometimes we get a curveball. And we think, and the question is, do we adapt? We may be in a business and things don't work out the way we do, and we're so stuck in doing it the same way. We're always going to do it for the rest of our lives. And the business goes down the tubes, and one day we have a meeting with a bankruptcy lawyer. It could be in our personal relationships. We have a child that gets sick. We have another challenge in life. And instead of meeting that challenge and adapting to it and realize that happened to us by divine providence, we can do it, we don't do that. So I think first and remarkably, is the Rebbe's sense of ability to change, to meet the challenges of life. And I also see with him constantly asking himself, what is my mission for being here? It's not about me, it's what is the divine providence orchestrating me to do? And I think if we look at our own lives, that everything happens by divine providence, it's going to cause us to see life in a very different way.
Wow. It's amazing to hear that shift because the entire time that we were speaking this evening and reading the book, I was thinking to myself, wow, you're an incredible historian, but what does that have to do with 2025? What does that have to do with us right now? I mean, the world is so different today. And
I don't. I think it has a lot to do with us. For instance, anti-Semitism. What is the Jewish community doing in anti-Semitism? Every Jewish organization is getting up there. Madani is now mayor of New York and is making me feel uncomfortable. Why don't you get up there and say, we're facing down evil? What did the Rebbe do? He stood up to evil and he said, you're evil and I'm facing up to you. He was unafraid. He was unabashed. He didn't talk about his personal feelings. Oh, it's so interesting. Here in where I live in Orange County, California, about a year and a half ago when the war started, so Arab groups started going to city councils. We have a lot of cities in the county and trying to get them to pass resolutions for a ceasefire. So I would go to these I went to a few of these meetings, and every Jew gets up there. Hello, I'm a member of Temple Beth, whatever, and this will make me feel uncomfortable. This is what they say. We're going to make me feel uncomfortable. It's not safe for me to do this. And I got up there and I said, listen, first thing, this thing is a joke. Why are we asking for a ceasefire in Santa Ana, California, or whatever city it may be? They see these guys are losing the war, so they're trying to make a PR stunt. But let's talk about Hamas. Hamas has a charter. And in the charter, it says that they want to destroy the state of Israel and kill every single Jew in the world, including the Jewish citizens of this town. That's what you want to support. So what did the Rebbe do? The Rebbe stood up and faced down greatest evil and was never afraid. We are walking around, most Jewish organizations are raising a ton of money and walking around like a bunch of nevachs. It's when it comes now to the challenge of anti-Semitism, we need to stand up to it and face it down and say, guess what? What you're doing is evil. You want to support BDS at your local Concordia University? Okay, good. Let's talk about the 22 Arab countries. Is there any democracy? What happens? What happens to somebody who doesn't agree with their value system? How are women treated? How are gays treated? I may not agree with gay marriage personally, but I don't believe in hanging people by the trees. And what is their intent in their charter? To kill me. Do you know that in Jordan you get a death sentence if you sell a piece of land to a Jew? I mean, let's have a little guts and stand up. And what the Rebbe did is he stood up to the most powerful empire of the time, the Soviet Union, and he faced them down. He was unafraid. So that's the first powerful lesson we can learn from him. And then the second lesson is that when it came to America, and it's like we just had a conversation in our community. They instituted a whole security thing. They spent a lot of money on security. Sometimes you need security, sometimes you don't need security, but money is being shifted from Jewish education to security. What is security? Sometimes you need it. A lot of times it's some nervous Nellies that are all worried about something that's going to happen to you. What did the Rebbe realize? That it was one way to have a future for Judaism in America, in Western countries, in Canada, America, etc., was Jewish education. And he invested his heart and soul in building the first network of Jewish education in the United States. He opened the first network of day schools. He changed Montreal by opening up the Chabad Yeshiva. He writes a beautiful language to the rabbis in Montreal, the young rabbinical students, that they have to go and gather the precious lilies. He calls the children of Montreal who don't have Jewish education precious lilies. That's what he writes in his beautiful poetic Hebrew, and bring them and teach them Torah and bring them in underneath, and connect them to Hashem above. So here we have two important things. How do we deal with anti-Semitism? By standing up to it and being unafraid. How do we deal with Jewish continuity? By educating our children. So I think his strategies are applicable today.
wow, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you uh, for your work. And I wish I went on Amazon today and I saw that the book is available now. It wasn't before in Canada, but I saw that today it is available in Canada. There was even a little discount on it, and I'm not sure why.
Oh boy! And the Canadian dollar, you're suffering in the Canadian dollar.
Exactly. And so uh,
So
it's an
I would encourage
incredible
them to
read,
buy the
the book.
book.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure.